Well, thank you very much, particularly for the announcements. Let's hope I can live up to them yesterday as well as today. I will focus on policies and practices and in particular also give you some insights in what currently foundations are doing in this area, because I felt that that could actually be something that could complement the paper, which otherwise I found very inspiring and very helpful. So thank you very much for the presentation as well as for the draft. I think you mentioned yesterday that it's still a multi-author paper, but on the other hand, I think you can work your way through that. I will focus on 5 main points. The first one is related to content and what doctoral students these days need to be educated for. The second one is on differences and discrepancies. So how can we actually face the issue that was already addressed, brain drain, brain circulation. The third one on doctoral programs in context, so how to embed the respective doctorates in transnational cooperations. The fourth one is on creating islands of hope, the role of foundations in long-term capacity building for sub-Saharan Africa. That is specifically devoted to activities which my foundation and others are running in order to develop, hopefully, a kind of sustainable capacity building for developing countries. And we can perhaps discuss that later on, to what extent that is a response to the challenges addressed in the previous comment. And finally, I will address the way ahead. As a head of a foundation, I always take an optimistic view, which is close to what Albert Einstein once said when he said, amidst all the difficulties, there's also room for opportunities. And I hope that we can identify some of the opportunities. I once gave a talk in front of the German Chemical Society, and there I quoted the philosopher and physicist Lichtenberg, who once said, someone who knows only chemistry doesn't know chemistry either. Of course, with my background in the humanities and social sciences, you can be sure that the chemists raised their eyebrows and were quite concerned. But I then had an ally in Alvin Quirum, professor from the University of Washington. I think you must know him, Marisi. And he, in his essay, addressed very clearly that it's not sufficient just to have doctoral students focus entirely on their area of expertise, but that you need to broaden the competencies, particularly in view of the knowledge-based economy. If we talk about the huge issues ahead, of course, usually we are so impressed by the overall facts and figures, but if you do it the other way around and scale it down, you can easily recognize that at the end of this list, 80 would live in bad housing conditions, but the final point is only 1 would have a university education if the world were a village of just 100 people. I think it's important to keep that in mind, and then, of course, the doctoral students are only a fraction of that. So I think we should just be aware of the fact that we are talking about a very, very critical aspect of the further development. With respect to the major changes and challenges in research and higher education, I foresee, it was already mentioned in the previous talk, of course, the electronic impact on the creation, distribution, and absorption of new knowledge. I think that is one of the major issues of concern. But just as important is, I think, the increased emphasis on transdisciplinary research, whether you call it mode 2 or problem-driven approaches. I think it's pretty clear that that also has to be addressed in an environment, in a university, which is still largely structured according to disciplines. And so to really create this kind of research environment which then enables the students to address the issues is something we have not really solved. And the third point, of course, how can we move from the usual bi- or trilateral kind of agreements approach towards network approaches and strategic alliances in higher education? And last but not least, of course, between universities in the developing world and research universities in the developed world. And I think it was Kofi Annan who in 2003 in an editorial in Science addressed the issue that the number of scientists in proportion to population in developing countries is 10 to 30 times smaller than in developed countries. So 95% of the new science in the world is created in the countries comprising only 1/5 of the world's population. And much of that science, he adds, in the realm of health, for example, neglects the problems that afflict most of the world's people. So a huge challenge which we have to face. And by somebody else, by Branson McKinley, also the issue was addressed that more African scientists and engineers are working in the United States than there are in Africa. So the emigration of technically skilled people has left roughly 20,000 scientists and engineers in Africa to provide services to 600 million people. And one of the key challenges, and I was just attending a conference on engineering sciences in Africa last week in Lusaka in Zambia, is of course that in order to even develop an infrastructure, you have a huge lack of engineers and technicians in most areas. That is the crucial gap which is to be bridged. So I think there is clearly a need for collaboration and partnership. And the problem can only be addressed if we are not just thinking about North-South collaborations, but also integrate South-South collaborations at the same time. It's not easy to do so. Sometimes it's even easier for the African researchers, for instance, to fly to Germany than to fly across Africa to their colleagues somewhere else. So I think we will have to think about developing a new approach that is actually enabling also the researchers in the developing countries to develop a sense of ownership, to define the research agenda, and to create jointly an environment that can help both sides to solve the problems. And that can only be done if we really face the problems involved, and that is a major issue is unequal distribution of resources. So in the north you find the theoretical knowledge, the research infrastructure, the financial resources, human resources that are well trained, networks, and of course, last but not least, access to and understanding of the funding systems. Whilst in the south, of course, local knowledge, local access, young talents are available. But the question is, how can we integrate them into a context that is of mutual benefit to both? And these are just the topics we've been going through over the past 7 years. So we started off with communicable diseases, then we moved on to resources, violence, its impact and coping strategies, political and economic dynamics, and we also covered the humanities on an issue called negotiating culture. So the transformation, if you like, also of indigenous African cultures through globalization and what that means for the respective communities in Africa. And of course, the positive aspects of this approach are that due to this two-step process, first to define the issues, then to have, or even three-stage process I should say, then you have the pre-proposals, and then those who are let's say, recommended for sending in a full application get some seed money in order to then develop the full proposal jointly so that they can have a workshop to meet. And again, the African researchers can bring to the table what they feel is needed in order to develop this or that project so that, let's say, there is a sense of ownership right from the start. And some of the foundations are also involved now in institution building and try to support the core activities within these various areas, particularly, of course, in health research, in HIV/AIDS. The whole funding is coming from, let's say, in large parts from the Gates Foundation and others. And my foundation, as well as 5 others, are now involved in setting up something similar for the neglected tropical diseases, which are not covered by the major agencies. So to conclude, I think what needs to be done to overcome the disparities between advanced and developing countries, first of all, to foster science, scholarship and research for and in developing countries. So not just to attract people to the laboratories in the north, but see to it that they always are working in an embedded environment which also provides strong incentives for them to return to their home base. Build mutual trust, create symmetric partnerships and define a common research agenda, improve impact by combining efforts for research funding in developing countries, and also ensure sustainability of career prospects and funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.